Okay, we're on page 30. And we're up to the paragraph, second paragraph on the page. Originally, our ancestors were idol worshippers. But now, I'm not going to translate omnipresent because I think there's a mistake, as I said yesterday. Hamakom, Hashem, has brought us near to his service. As it is written, Joshua said to all the people, so says Hashem, God of Israel, your fathers always lived beyond the river, which happens to be the Euphrates, Terach, the father of Abraham, and Nachor, and they served other gods. Then I took your father Abraham from beyond the river, and I led him through all the land of Canaan. I multiplied his offspring and gave him Isaac. To Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. To Esau I gave Mount Seir to inherit. But Jacob and his children went down to Egypt. The but is the contribution of the translator. So we asked, what is this doing in the Haggadah? The Haggadah is supposed to be an account of the exodus from Egypt. And this verse from Joshua doesn't mention Egypt or the exodus from Egypt. And I told you there's a disagreement in the Talmud as to whether this paragraph belongs here or not. The one who rejects it says we're talking about the exodus from Egypt. This paragraph isn't part of that subject. The question is, what's going on with the one who includes it? Why does he want it there? We said yesterday, true, if you want to understand a historical event or a historical period, it helps to fill in the background. Sometimes it helps to fill in some of the foreground, what happened afterward. But that is a limitless process. The more background you add in, the better your understanding will be. So if it were just a gesture to fill in some background, we would have to ask how the author decided where to stop. He went back to Abraham's father. Why didn't he go back to Noah and the flood? Why didn't he go back to the creation? Or why was it necessary to go that far back? How about starting just with the birth of Moses? Because he's the chief human character in the story, so maybe you want background on his history. The answer has to be that this isn't just extra background, and the choice of where to start from was arbitrary. No, the thought has to be this background is necessary to have any understanding of the Exodus. If you don't understand this, you don't get the Exodus at all. Why would that be? There's a deep philosophical idea here. Going out of Egypt is the Exodus from slavery to freedom. The question is, what is freedom? Why is freedom important? What's the Jewish picture on why freedom is important? Is it simply that being a slave is to be a victim, a moral victim, a political and social victim, and God cares about morality? That doesn't seem right. There was slavery throughout the ancient world. There is slavery right now in North Africa. Muslim Arabs keep black people as slaves, and God doesn't save them. So it doesn't seem that God is just simply against slavery. It doesn't even seem as if he's against slavery for his own people, because for the majority of our history, we have not had an independent nation. And for considerable periods of our history, we've been under the bitter control of host nations, which have tortured us in various ways. So that's not what's driving the exodus from the slavery in Egypt to freedom. Well, the introductory words of this paragraph tell us the answer. Originally, our ancestors were idol worshippers, but now Hashem has brought us near to his service. That's the point of freedom. The point of freedom is that while we were slaves in Egypt, It was impossible for us to engage in his service in the way that he wanted us to. And we left Egypt in order to get to Sinai, to receive the Torah, to be able to serve him in the way in which he wanted to be served. Freedom for us is a means and not an end. Freedom has no intrinsic value. I spoke not long ago in the evening about the value of freedom. Freedom has no value of its own. The value of freedom for a particular person in a particular place and time is what he can do with that freedom. And for him, it's not only what he can do, but what he will do. The last verse in the Shema, in the third paragraph, says this graphically: I am Hashem your God who took you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. That's why I took you out. So if you don't understand what the value of freedom is, what its significance is, then you don't understand the point of the story of the Exodus from Egypt. You don't understand what it's for. So I think that's one way to explain why the other opinion says, yes, you need this paragraph because you have to understand the value of freedom. And that's why the starting point is Terach. It's the transition from Abraham's father, who was an idol worshiper, to entering into a HaKadosh Baruch Hu's service and seeing the Exodus from Egypt as a portion of that longer transition. That's one way to explain why this paragraph is here. Are we together? Okay, let's go on. Oh, I can't see without my glasses. Now here is a very tricky paragraph. Blessed is he who keeps his pledge to Israel. Blessed is he. For the Holy One, blessed is he, calculated the end of the bondage in order to do as he said to our father Abraham at the covenant between the parts. As it is stated, he said to Avram, know with a certainty that your offspring will be aliens in a land not their own. They will serve them, and they will oppress them 400 years. But also upon the nation which they shall serve will I execute judgment, and afterward they shall leave with great possessions. Okay, so first of all, this paragraph says there was a calculation. What calculation is that? And now it says what Hashem said to Avram, know with a certainty that your children will be aliens in a land not their own. They will serve them. Who's that? Who's the they that is serving the them? Just pronouns. They is Abraham's descendants. Will serve them is the owners of the land. And they will oppress them. Now it reverses. The they is the owners of the land, will oppress Abraham's descendants. So it just switches. Now that's all right. 400 years. Now there's an ambiguity in the sentence up to here. It mentions 3 conditions: being aliens, serving, and oppression. And then it says 400 years. There are 3 different ways that you could read those words. Here's one way. Aliens, oppression, service and oppression. Alien service oppression describes a single period of 400 years. You could read it that way. Or you could read aliens. How long? Not telling you. 2,000 years, 20,000 years. I'm silent on that. But oppression and service and oppression is 400 years. Or you could read it aliens and service. Not telling you how long. Could be as long as you like. And it would be oppression that's 400 years. You have A, B, C, 400. It could be A, B, and C together are 400. Or it's A is separate and B and C are 400. Or it's A and B are separate and C is 400. There are 3 different ways to read the verse. What difference does it make? In which way of reading the verse is the sum total of time the minimum?
ABC together.
If I take ABC together, say it's 400 years, that's the minimum amount. If I put A on the side and say B and C are 400, I don't know how long A is. Could be much longer. Put A and B on the outside and put 400 on C, then it could be even longer. There are 3 different ways to read the verse. Chishev Esaketz, calculated at the end, means Chodesh Baruch Hu decided which way to read the verse. And as a matter of fact, if you calculate the dates, you see that it's A, B, and C all together that make 400. From the birth of Isaac, which is Abraham's offspring, and they're living in the land of Canaan, which they do not possess. So the existence of his offspring being aliens in a land not belonging to them begins with the birth of Isaac. From the birth of Isaac to the Exodus is 400 years. The slavery was about 90 years. The period of time in Egypt was 210 years. Not all the period of time in Egypt were they slaves. Now let's see. Chishev Esaketz. The 400 years which should have been, well, let me put it this way. Take the 400 years and subtract the word kates, the numerical value of the word kates. Kates is, kuf is 100 and tzadi is 90. Subtract 190 from 400, you get 210. Isn't that convenient? That's the number of years they were in Egypt. So it comes out that if you start with Isaac, the birth of Isaac, you take the time in Egypt is minimized, because if you didn't have, that means that's the whole period is 400 years. If you didn't have that, then the time in Egypt could have been much longer. So Kadosh Baruch Hu read the verse with the minimum amount of time that we suffer this condition. Why did he do that? He did that because had he waited any longer, there wouldn't have been anybody to save. Our tradition tells us that there are 50 gates of defilement, and we had already gone through 49. To wait any longer would mean there would have been nobody left to save. So Kadosh Baruch Hu read it in the shortest possible way. But because of that, there's some leftover job that has to be done, and that characterizes the subsequent history in certain ways. At any rate, that's what the verse is saying. Now, the next paragraph also has an ambiguity in it, and it's a very crucial ambiguity. It is this that has stood by our fathers and us. For not only one has risen against us to annihilate us, but in every generation they rise against us to annihilate us, and the Kodesh Baruch Hu, the Holy and Blessed be He, rescues us from their hand. Okay. I want to ask the simplest possible question. Every 6-year-old will ask. This four lines. It says, it is this that has stood by our fathers. What's the this? So I think naturally, intuitively, when people read it the first time, many people the 10th time and the 100th time, it's read like this. It is this that has stood by our fathers and us, because every generation we have enemies who try to annihilate us, And HaKadosh Baruch Hu promised us that He'll save us. So it's that promise that He'll save us that has stood by us in all the generations. I think you can read it that way. But there's another way to read it. And that is, what has stood by our fathers and us is the whole package. What has stood for us and been ready for us is both the opposition and attack of our enemies and the Kodesh Baruch Hu saving us from their hand. The whole package is what has stood for us. It is this that has stood by our fathers and us, namely, not only one is risen against annihilate us, every generation they rise against annihilate us, that's one thing, that people want to annihilate us, that has stood for us, and the Kodesh Baruch Hu saves us. Now, why would the idea of enemies standing against us to annihilate us, why would that be a promise and something that stands for us? Isn't that something that stands against us? Now, the Netziv has an essay on anti-Semitism. It's printed at the back of his commentary on the book of Ruth. I was introduced to this by Rabbi Mazelman, along with 1,000 other things. And he says that the ability to survive in exile and to thrive in exile and to be appreciated in exile is in our own hands. The verses that describe, including the one that we just read a moment ago, the verses describe what our attitude should be when we're in exile, how we should conduct ourselves in exile, and if we do so, we will not be in danger. We only come into danger when we lose our grip, when we lose our focus, when we are deteriorating. Then the opposition of the others against us serves to bring us back. What is the clue? Hey Na'ab Badad Yeshev. This nation shall dwell alone. It shall be physically isolated, and it shall be culturally isolated, and religiously isolated, and socially isolated. It shall dwell alone. Cut off. Now, those who have studied a little Jewish history, I could ask you a trick question. Who made the first ghetto? So, of course, you say, well, the word ghetto is an Italian word. And in fact, in Italy, there were ghettos. That's not the right answer. The first ghetto was made by Joseph. He says to Jacob, when he's coming down with his whole family, you're going to live in Goshen, close to me, in an isolated area. Not only that, but when I present you to Pharaoh and you identify yourselves, say to Pharaoh that you're shepherds, because the Egyptians hate shepherds. Why do they hate shepherds? Because the shepherds tend and then use, slaughter, and eat the animals which the Egyptians hold to be sacred animals. And Egypt was a cosmopolitan society, and it tolerated people who had different customs from theirs, but they didn't like them. Indeed, when the brothers come down, when Joseph is still in Egypt, when the brothers come down and Joseph prepares a meal for them, it says that the company ate in three groups. There were the Jews and the Egyptian servants and attendants. They couldn't eat at the same table because the Jews were eating food which the Egyptians would find an abominable thing to do. And Joseph sat at his own table. But the verse says that Joseph had the food for the Jews prepared according to the Jewish custom. They slaughtered the animals because, being a cosmopolitan society, you make room for people who have customs different from yours, but you wouldn't want to live with that. You wouldn't want to be part of that. So Joseph said, I'm setting you up in an isolated environment. And I'm setting up a social barrier between you and the other groups, the rest of the Egyptians. And there's a physical barrier, and that is circumcision. When they came down to Egypt, they were all circumcised. That's how you be successful. And says the Netziv, as long as all of those conditions were met, the Egyptians loved them. Not only tolerated them and left them alone, they loved them. Because there's a verse, Vayafoch es libam lisnoas amo. I think that's the right words. He had to turn their hearts over to hate his people. That means the hatred was something that the Kodesh Baruch Hu instigated. When did he do that? Well, after the last of the original 12 tribes died, the remaining population began to drift. First, they drifted geographically. They moved out of Goshen, so that when the Exodus takes place, it says every Jew had a neighbor who was an Egyptian. They were living side by side. And then the oral tradition tells us that they stopped doing circumcision, except for the tribe of Levi. Nobody else did circumcision. That's why the Torah says that you have to do circumcision before you leave. So you lost the geographical separation, and you lost the separation of the covenant. And the Egyptians, to whatever extent, made their peace with the proximity of the Jews, and therefore the Jews gave up that formula. When they gave up that formula, HaKadosh Baruch Hu turned the hearts of the Egyptians against them, and they came to hate them. So that fact then helped to stem the deterioration. You know, it was very interesting. I've been to South Africa many times, maybe 20 times. When I first went there 42 years ago, talk about Jewish identity and about intermarriage, the intermarriage rate was 0. 0. So I asked why. He says, very simple, because the other 3 ethnic groups that you have in South Africa won't have Jews. They just don't want them. The blacks don't want them, and the Dutch Boers don't want them, and the English don't want them. So there's a 0 assimilation rate. At least there's a 0 intermarriage rate. And since there's no intermarriage, and there's no social intermingling and friendship, there was a very strong traditional identity there. That's what wanted to be kept up. And this is something which repeats itself over and over in history. And in our time, the most striking and tragic example of this is that Germany was the author of the final solution and was the engine to put the final solution into action. And Germany was, if not the most, is one of the most places where the assimilation was the most. The Jews in Germany, by and large, integrated into German society, adopted German customs, adopted the German language. The Reform movement was there. The slogan was, "Berlin is our Jerusalem." Okay. So according to the Netziv, you do that, and Kodesh Baruch Hu turns their heart to hate you. And that's exactly what happened. So that means that you have to read, this is where the Netziv reads the paragraph, that the whole of the package, them hating us and HaKadosh Baruch Hu saving us, that package is what preserved us down through the generations. I think linguistically you could read it either way, and the message in reading it the way I just described is very profound. Yeah, we're together? Okay. Yeah, man.
In Galus, in many countries, there is a lot of religious communities, but there's also a lot of assimilated communities. Like how do we know when the red lights are?
You don't know. You don't know. Kodesh Baruch Hu takes many things into account. This is a principle, but there are other principles. I was just now in Europe with my Rebbe who was giving lectures to a group of women from America, and we were in Budapest, and there you have the exhibition of the shoes, 60 pairs of italicized shoes from the Holocaust. Heartbreaking, because what they did is they lined them up at the Danube River, and shot them, and they fell into the water. And and the shoes are of all different sizes, and men's and women's and children's, and they're not lined up. They're like as if people were just sort of strolling along and then suddenly disappeared. Very moving exhibition. One guide that we had in Hungary said that the Hungarian Jews were sure that they were safe. One of the women on the trip said, my grandmother said, we're Hungarians. We're Hungarians. Certainly they're not going to do anything to us. We're Hungarians. That's what they said. And then the Hungarian guide said, the Hungarians killed Jews for no reason at all. They didn't buy into the Nazi propaganda. Jews are trying to take over the world. Jews drink Christian blood for the matzahs at Pesach time. Jews are in charge of the international banks, the international media, and so on. No, they just killed Jews, that's all. They just killed them. Just as unimaginable as it was the Hungarian Jews, so it was unimaginable to the German Jews. Not only to the German Jews, but Jews elsewhere, when they began to get reports of mass killings, it is documented, we have documents on it. The leaders of other communities couldn't believe it. The Germans wouldn't do that. The Germans? The most cultured, the highest educated, the best in science, the best in music, the best in literature, and so on. The Germans are doing it. It's impossible. It's impossible. It's unthinkable. It's unthinkable and true. And talk to American Jews. How did they feel 20 years ago? Did they imagine that they'd be afraid in their synagogues and afraid to go in the street, and the cemeteries would be defaced and everything else? They imagined it was happening en masse, publicly and with pride. That Jewish students in universities would be afraid to move, afraid to identify themselves? Did they dream of that? Their attitude was the same. We're Americans. We're Americans like other Americans. No, you aren't. No, you aren't. You're not Americans like other Americans. You're dreaming. I didn't see the movie, but I read a review of A Ship of Fools. So a ship that was left Europe, had Jews on it. And this one's worried about her mink coat, and that one's worried about this gambling record, and they're worried about the food. They're all going to die. They didn't even realize it. So this is what he's saying. The Chamaliki pogroms, some said at the time, that Jews had become very comfortable in Europe. The joke is told in some place in Europe, they hear the Mashiach is coming. Mashiach is going to be there, and his husband and wife, and one says to the other, maybe he won't come until Monday when the new sheep are coming in. At least we'll have our sheep. Right. The Mashiach, coming of Mashiach, but we should have our sheep, Why shouldn't we have our sheep? That's like your they say in Hebrew, Seder Adifuyot, your priorities really aren't too straight if you're worried about your sheep when the Mashiach is coming. And this is true for the assimilated Jews, and it's true to a certain extent for the non-assimilated Jews. And the hatred of the local population may be designed to serve as much to prevent the further slide of the religious Jews as it is to challenge the identity of the assimilated Jews. In this country, after October 7th, some people on the left changed their minds. Some people in the public eye publicly acknowledged that, on the left, acknowledged that their picture of the world and how it works was incorrect, especially the women, who got zero support all over the world from women's groups who are supposed to be championing women's rights. The torture and the rape and all the rest of the Jewish women means nothing to them. They thought they had solidarity with these people. Absolutely not. You're a Jew. You don't have solidarity with them. At any rate, that's part of what the Netziv says. Okay, now comes a section, a very interesting section. There are 4 verses in the book of Deuteronomy which describe a Jewish farmer in the land of Israel bringing his first fruits to the temple. He comes up to the temple and he gives the fruits to the Kohen, and he makes a declaration about a very short summary declaration of his history, where we were, where we came from, and the fact that we are now living in the land of Israel, and I'm celebrating the fact of my first fruits, and I'm giving thanks to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So, the Haggadah takes those 4 verses, and then explains each word or phrase in terms of mostly verses from the book of Exodus, which elaborate on the details of the story, and sometimes from books elsewhere, which give insight into what the concepts are. And the question is, why is it done that way? If we're telling the story of the Exodus, shouldn't we just read from the book of the Exodus? Book of the Exodus, story of the Exodus, that's where it is. Just read a few chapters straight. No. Well, of course, Jews don't do anything in a simple way. They do it in a complicated way. But I think the message here is very clear. Who's saying this Seder? Who's living it? Who's doing the mitzvos? These are people who are living the land of Israel, and the temple is built, and they go there to perform the Paschal sacrifice. These are not slaves or former slaves. These are people who are living successful lives the way HaKadosh Baruch Hu arranged it for them. So the 4 verses of the book of Deuteronomy express that condition, that perspective. So that's what the declaration really is. We are in a condition of safety and a condition of prosperity, and we are looking back at our history. Then the ideas are greatly elaborated for each word or phrase, quoting other verses that elaborate on them. That's the structure. Now, the introduction to the structure is, we're on top of page 33. Go and learn what Lavan the Aramean attempted to do to our father Jacob. For Pharaoh decreed only against the males, and Lavan attempted to uproot everything. As it is said, an Aramean attempted to destroy my father. And he descended to Egypt and sojourned there with few people. And there he became a nation, great, mighty, and numerous. So there are a lot of things to talk about here. First of all, what does it mean, go and learn? We have a literature which invites study. In the Babylonian Talmud, the phrase that invites study is come and listen. Toh Shma. Come and listen. In the Jerusalem Talmud and in the Zohar, it's come and see. One is listen and one is see. Tochazi or tochami. This is different for both. Those are both based on come. This is based on go. And it isn't go and hear and go and see, it's go and learn. I did find this phrase in 1 or 2 other places, but the other phrases occur hundreds of times. So something very interesting is going on here. Why wouldn't this be the phraseology of the Babylonian Talmud or the phraseology of the Jerusalem Talmud and the Zohar? So, what does it mean, say? What are you going out of? If I invite you to learn something, if I'm not wasting your time, I'm going to tell you something you don't know. And you may be more interested or less interested. But what happens if you have an inner resistance to what I'm saying? What happens if you're prejudiced about it? You have preconceived notions about it? Like when you talk to historians or anthropologists about the fact that Jewish history is qualitatively different from the history of every other nation in the world. He will look at you glassy-eyed and say, of course not. Everybody's the same. All the nations are the same. They all have the same dynamics. They all follow the same rules. What do you mean they're different? Can't be. It can't be. Human beings are human beings. He can't hear you. He can't hear you. Tzei means you're under the control of certain prejudices, and I'm requiring of you that you reconsider them and break those bonds, because otherwise you won't hear my message at all. And then it's going to require learning. Vision has the quality that usually, though not always, but usually you could take in the whole scene quickly and with tremendous accuracy. You look around for 7 seconds and you know what's in the room. Somebody asks you what's in the room, you can tell the tables and chairs, there's a box standing with a book on it, which has a hole in it, and there are lights, and you don't make mistakes. You might make one mistake, but you can give off 25 features right away. Listening to a lecture, that takes time. To get the lecture, you got to remember in the middle what was said at the beginning. The end, you got to put it all together. That's hard. That's harder. Still, it might be communicating something to you that you just receive. Learning is something else. Learning means you have to interpret, and you have to compare and contrast, and you have to consider objections. That's a much more difficult process. Here it says, Tzei Ulmad. There's something you need to learn, and in order to learn it, you have to leave your preconceptions. Now let's take a look at this verse. I think you'll see right in the verse, this is illustrated. It says, and Aramean attempted to destroy my father. Well, look at the Hebrew, so that I can show you that the verse is really quite ambiguous, and the commentators are divided. Arami and Aramean, Oved. Oved means to be lost. It's not a causative, makes lost, chases away, pursues. It's to be lost. Avi, my father. One translation of this is, my father was a wandering Aramean. The Haggadah says, don't translate it like that. Translate it like this. Arami, an Aramean, Oved, wanted to destroy. Transitive verb, my father. Well, that's not obvious. It's not obvious at all. Then it says, Vayered Mitzrayim, and he went down to Egypt. Well, let's see. Who went down to Egypt? Which of our fathers? Jacob, right? Was he a wandering Aramean? Was he an Aramean at all? Did he wander? I mean, he went to various places, but he went at the divine command. And each place he knew where he was going, he knew why he was going. If you push it to the history, it's hard to say that he was a wandering Aramean. But then you're going to have to read Oved as a transitive verb, wanted to destroy somebody else, not just wandering or being lost. And then, let's see, this Aramean was Lavan, and Jacob spent time in Lavan's house, about 20 years, married the two sisters, Leah and Rachel, worked another 6 years, and then came back. You look at that period of time, where the Torah describes it, not at all obvious that he wanted to destroy him. Destroy him? I mean, he didn't attack him with weapons. There was no war that was fought. He didn't come sneaking in the middle of the night and slit his throat. I mean, where do we see that Lavan wanted to destroy him? I think there are hints to it, but there's only hints. And then, after he left Lavan, he didn't go to Egypt. He came back to Israel. And he was there for years, decades, until Joseph sent to bring him down to Egypt. So why would you say that an Aramean wanted to destroy my father and he went to Egypt? when there's a lot of time in between? So, what I'm telling you now is partly the verses and partly the Netziv again. The verses with Lavan say the following. He was there and he wanted to marry Rachel, and Lavan said fine, and on the wedding night he switched her for Leah, and then he gave Rachel to him a week later, and he asked him for another 7 years of service, and after 14 years, Jacob said, I've served you 14 years, I want to go home. And he said, yeah, I know, but I've figured out that my flocks have greatly increased because of you. I want you to stay with me. And he does stay with him another 6 years. I think that the reason was gratitude, but that's a long story I'm not going into now. And after 6 years, Lavan and his children turn against Jacob, and Jacob feels that, he understands that, because they had set up a deal that a certain physically described portion of the flock would belong to Jacob, and then all of a sudden, all the flocks bore only Jacob's type of animals. So then Lavan changed it, to change the description over and over again, and each time the animals came out, and then Jacob became very great, he had lots of, and Lavan's possessions dwindled, and they began to get angry at him. And Jacob saw that, so he ran. When Lavan was away, he ran. Lavan gets together a lot of people, and he comes after Jacob. The night before he confronts Jacob, he has a dream. And Hashem says to him, don't speak to Jacob about anything bad or good. So, Lavan comes in the morning, and he says to him, you stole my gods, and you stole my daughters. You took them away like captives of the sword, which is absolutely not true. Jacob asked them for their opinion without prejudice, and they volunteered to go with him. And he says, I have in the power of my hand to do you, plural, evil, but your God came to me last night and said, leave Jacob alone. I have the power of my hand to do you evil. But your God came and told me not to do it. I'm afraid. But otherwise, I have plans for you. What plans? Doesn't say exactly. Later on, Lavan says, the children are my children, and the flocks are my flocks. What shall I do to these? That's Lavan the benevolent, Lavan the family man, Lavan the father, the grandfather, right? But didn't he say 10 minutes ago that I have in the power of my hand to do you evil? Plural? Yeah, he did. And he didn't do evil because God stopped him. So what do you mean, these are mine and I wouldn't do anything? You certainly would have done something to all of them. Well, that's a hint that there's something more going on in the story than we're getting on the surface. Now God is telling us that Lavan's plan was that Jacob's dreams will die with him. Jacob is there. He's surrounded by Lavan's culture, surrounded by Lavan's population. And if Jacob remains faithful to his dreams, the grandchildren belong to me. Their mothers are my daughters. And they'll never carry out your dream. That's where he planned to uproot the whole thing. That's what this verse says. There's a verse here, right? And Aramean attempted to destroy my father. Now says the Netziv. There's no then in the Hebrew. The translator tries to make it more familiar to an English speaker, but there's no then. And I'm telling you this, there were many years in between. The Netziv says that's why he went down to Egypt. Because remember that the secret of success in exile is to be isolated, right? That's what Joseph set up in Egypt. To be geographically isolated and socially isolated and physically isolated by bris milah, right? With Lavan, that wasn't possible. I'm saying this now. I believe what the meant. With Lavan, that was impossible. His wives are Lavan's daughters, after all. His children are Lavan's grandchildren. You can't isolate yourself there. You can't go off and live in a mountain and never see the family. And that's why it had to be arranged that he shouldn't stay there. He wouldn't have survived there, because the method of preserving under Golos conditions couldn't be enacted there. And that's why he went to Egypt. Not that when he left Lavan he went to Egypt, but he was taken away from Lavan, and he ended up in Egypt, because in Egypt this formula for survival in exile could be put into place. So that's what's going on in this verse. I haven't plumbed all of it, but you begin to see now there's something here that isn't on the surface, and there's something here that might require you to rethink your assumptions about people. And I will just make one comment now, and I may repeat it again later. People say you're celebrating the Exodus and you're thanking God for the Exodus from slavery. But who arranged the slavery? Isn't God running the world? Isn't God running the conditions? So how is it that you're thanking God for the Exodus but not complaining to God about the slavery? Why do you look at it as praise of God? And for some people, this is a great objection. Great objection. But I told you the answer. I told you the answer 20 minutes ago. As long as they followed the procedure that God told them, gave them, they weren't slaves. They were loved by the Egyptians. When they abandoned what the procedure is that God gave them, that's when they came to be persecuted. So it's not a question of God's having visited something bad on them and they should complain. Who are they going to complain to? Who are they going to complain about? They themselves abandoned the procedure for staying safe and beloved in exile. Okay, have a wonderful Shabbos, and I will see you, Yis Hashem, on